Greetings from the sunny Southern California to all the members of the European Academy of Religion and to all those who follow the work of this important organization. We were supposed to deliver our presentations in Bologna in June at our meeting, but it could not happen, as we know, and we pre-record our presentations. My presentation today will be on politicization of religion and its Eastern Christian cases. And in my presentation, I will address the issue of religion being politicized. This issue has been well studied in the West, but is almost ignored by scholarship in the East. At the same time, the Eastern patterns of politicized religion are prototypes of many Western patterns. In looking at the Eastern cases of politicized religion, I'm going to utilize both a microscope and a telescope. First, drawing your attention to smaller cases, which will then reveal larger panoramic vistas. Let me start with the discussion of the term political theology, which took place in interwar Germany between two conservative Catholic soulmates, Carl Schmitt and Eric Peterson. Schmitt recoined the term political theology, which he, as a scholar of ancient Roman law, may have borrowed from Marcus Terentius Varro, who lived in the 1st century before Christ, who used it in a different context. Because of this recoinage, Schmitt is sometimes called the godfather of political theology. Well, of course he was not. There were many political theologies before him, even though they were not called political theologies. Schmitt used this catchphrase to explain his own theory of state. His concern was to identify the sources of legitimacy for laws. He believed that the state itself cannot be a source of its legal order. This order emerges ex nihilo, as it were. The initial legal order, according to Schmitt, is the result of a miracle which happens in the situation of emergency, as he called it. The source of this order cannot be truth or nature, but the authority personified. This train of thought proved useful for Adolf Hitler, who was looking for the legal means of overcoming the crisis of the Weimar constitutional order. Schmitt identified this crisis as a situation of emergency, which can be solved with the law personified. Thus, he established that a given political leader who personifies law is one who may override the existing constitutional norms. The Führer had his Eureka moment. Schmitt provided a theoretical framework for Hitler's rise to power. As the president of the National Socialist German Lawyer Association, he came to be the crown jurist of National Socialism. From justifying the extraordinary authority of the Führer, Schmitt evolved to defending extrajudicial killings of Hitler's political opponents and excluding Jews from German jurisprudence. After the war, he was tried in Nuremberg and was prohibited to teach in German universities. And this is despite the fact that most professors who collaborated with Nazis were allowed to teach, regardless of denazification. He continued to be an influential public intellectual with strong conservative views until his death in 1985. The concept of political theology was crucial for Schmitt because it helped him explain and reshape the established legal institutions by the instruments transcendent to law. He chose theology to be such an instrument and famously claimed that, I quote him, all significant concepts of the modern theory of the state are secularized theological concepts, end of quote. In other words, as Georgi Garebi has put it, I quote him, the conceptual framework of a world, even if deprived of the divine, still shows a theological structure, end of quote. Many modern scholars would concur with this point of Schmitt. But Eric Peterson, once a friend of Carl Schmitt, disagreed. He noted how Schmidt had utilized his concept of political theology to justify the Nazi regime, and sounded the alarm. However, Peterson objected not only to one particular ramification of political theology, but to the concept per se. In his argumentation, he used a particular case, which he believed would demonstrate that the entire method of analogy between the theological and political does not work. This was the case of theological monotheism being projected onto political monarchy in the period of Christian antiquity. Peterson focused on this case in his monograph Monotheismus als politisches Problem, where he argued that the triune God cannot be a model for political monarchy. The divine Trinity presupposes sharing power and not its usurpation by one person. Therefore, monarchs, whether they are emperors, kings, presidents, or der Führer, cannot refer to the Christian God in claiming legitimacy for their power. As Peterson wrote, I quote him, with the development of the Orthodox dogma, here he means the Homoousian interpretation of the Trinity, the idea of divine monarchy loses its political, theological character, end of quote. Peterson was not the first theologian who drew parallels between Christian monotheism and political ideologies. Liberal Anglicans tried to justify their Christian socialism as early as the beginning of the 20th century. The founder of the British Socialist Party and simultaneously a vicar of the Church of England, also known as the Red Vicar, Conrad Noel, believed that in the Arian controversies, I quote him, the principle at stake politically was democracy versus imperialism, for the Arians held that God was a solitary being remote from the interests of man, a somber emperor in the heavens, who had not been able to bridge the gulf between the heavens and the earth. Now, if this was so, they argued that such a solitary being was best represented upon earth by a solitary tyrant. End of quote. The response of the Nicene theologians to this belief was that, I quote Conrad Noel again, the highest form of unity which could be conceived by us was the collective unity of the many and the one. End of quote. Peterson may have had in mind these discussions about Christian socialism earlier in the century. He was certainly mindful of patristic insights. A key patristic text for him was an excerpt from the third theological oration by Gregory of Nazianzus, who lived in the 4th century. According to Gregory, there are three basic ideas about God: anarchy, polyarchy, and monarchy. The former two are pagan and unacceptable for Christians. From the Christian perspective, only monarchy can be accepted. However, this kind of monarchy is not singular and personal, but natural and shared. It is a result of the complete coherence of the divine persons who share one will and activity. Now I'm quoting Gregory of Nazianzus. We most respect monarchy. However, this is not a monarchy which is defined by one person, but a monarchy which is set together, synesthesis, he uses the word synesthesis, by the single honor of the nature, coherence of knowledge, identical movement, and the convergence towards one of those who are from this one. End of quote. Gregory uses the verb synesthesis, which, because of the prefix syn in the beginning, implies that the divine monarchy is composed, not singular. This is a way to say that it is shared. This kind of shared monarchy is possible only for God, but not for any human institution, created nature, as Gregory puts it. This is because the degree of the divine integrity is unachievable by humans. A political monarchy which is based on personality, i.e., the absolutist personal power, would fail to demonstrate coherence and integrity. Gregory remarks that such personal power necessarily incurs opposition from many. Only shared power, exercised in coherence, can produce harmony and unity. On the basis of this statement, Patterson concluded that the monarchy of the Christian God cannot be projected onto the monarchy of political rulers, including der Führer. It would not be an exaggeration to say that Patterson utilized the text from Gregory of Nazianzus to polemicize against Nazism in general and the Schmittinian political theology in particular. His study was a metaphor or coded message to communicate to Schmitt his concerns. In a footnote to his study, he hinted how blind and unforeseeing Cicero was in helping Augustus against Antony, because eventually this contributed to the dictatorship of the former. Jakob Taubes explained this metaphor in his letter to Schmitt. I quote him: "The cecus atque improvidus futurorum," that is, blind and unforeseeing the future, "was a coded warning directed at you, but you didn't get it." End of quote from the letter. Patterson was wrong to condemn political theology as such, but he was right to condemn political speculations based on Christian theology, or what we can more accurately render as politicization of religion. What Patterson had in mind was better articulated by his younger contemporary, Raymond Aron, who coined the term religion séculière. The primary focus of Aron's critique was Marxism and its incarnation in the system of global communism. But he also expanded the category of secular religion to Nazism. In his article, The Future of Secular Religions, published in 1944, he argued that both communism and Nazism reproduce, I quote him, reproduce certain distinctive characteristics of ancient dogmas. They too offer a global interpretation of the world, end of quote. This interpretation is divisive. It ontologizes evil by incarnating it in large social groups, who are to be contained or exterminated. I quote him again: "Eager to federate hatreds, convinced that humans are drawn together more by hostile emotions than by common affections, they," that is, communism and Nazism, "never rest from displaying to their followers new bastilles to storm." End of quote. Quite unexpectedly, Aron's choice of words was criticized by Hannah Arendt. In her article Religion and Politics, published in 1953, she addressed her critique mostly to Jules Monneron, but implicitly also to Raymond Aron. Arendt found any parallel between totalitarian ideologies and religion inappropriate, even blasphemous. She argued that the very nature of Christianity is to be apolitical. I quote her: "The freedom which Christianity brought into the world was a freedom from," this is emphasized by Hannah Arendt, "politics," end of quote. However, the sort of religion that Aron described, just as the sort of theology that Patterson criticized, was not religion or theology in the proper sense. Carl Schmitt was right that the main goal of political theology is to enhance the legitimacy of political regimes. Long before him, in early 4th century, Eusebius of Caesarea dealt with the legitimacy of the Roman imperial power, after this power had legalized Christianity. Before Constantine, the sole ruler of the empire from 324 through 337, the Roman Empire and the Christian Church treated each other as irreconcilable enemies. The empire tried to contain and even to extinguish the Church, while the Church impatiently waited for the kingdom of God to replace the kingdom of Caesar. After Constantine procured a truce with Christianity, legalized its status, and lifted all restrictions that had been imposed upon the Church by his predecessors. The empire, in return, awaited from the Church new arguments in support of its own legitimacy. Previously, maintaining this legitimacy was a sacred duty of the Greco-Roman public religion. Now a similar service was expected from the Christian Church. Eusebius was among those who sensed the new expectations, and with them new opportunities for the Church. In his bulky corpus of writings, he effectively designed a new legitimacy for the old empire. Eusebius thus, and not Carl Schmitt, should be celebrated as the father of Christian political theology. Eusebius borrowed two beliefs most valuable for Christians in the pre-Constantinian era and transformed them into two pillars of his political theology. First was respect to martyrs. Martyrs died because they were persecuted by the murderous empire. They were literally witnesses of faith and of the injustices that the Roman state incurred upon the Christian Church. Eusebius forged from high respect to martyrs a story where the presumably new empire succeeded the old one when Constantine stopped persecutions of the Church. Martyrdom was just the rising action in the structure of Eusebius's narrative. Its true climax was the reign of Constantine, the liberator of the Church, who opened doors to a new era. So it was presented by Eusebius. This new era constituted the second pillar of Eusebius's political theology. Although with somehow declining vigor, Christians by the time of Eusebius still believed that the kingdom of God is imminent, and that it was a matter of years, not centuries, when Christ would return. Eusebius transformed these eschatological expectations to a new legitimacy for the Roman Empire. After it stopped killing martyrs, this empire turned into the millennial kingdom that the Christians had been awaiting since apostolic times. The urge of Eusebius was simple: open your eyes. The kingdom of God is not coming, but it's already come. It has already come. Eusebius's political theology was millennialist. The archenemy of Christianity, the Roman Empire, had become the kingdom of God. True, it was not yet a full embodiment of this kingdom, but certainly its resemblance. The model suggested by Eusebius was familiar to anyone with elementary training in Platonism. This world is an imperfect image of the ideal world. It seems that many Christians, especially those who had recently converted from the educated classes of the Greco-Roman society, bought into Eusebius's model. At the same time, one cannot imagine a more convincing idea to substantiate the legitimacy of the Roman emperors in the eyes of all their Christian subjects. We know from modern scholarship that the early church did not focus on persecutions and martyrdom as much as Eusebius imagined. And Constantine did not want to rule the kingdom of God on earth. He probably did not even intend to change the socio-political structures of the empire he ruled. He just wanted an extra layer of legitimacy for his rule, in addition to the extant ones, such as, for instance, his pagan role as Pontifex Maximus. Nevertheless, the millennialist utopia designed by Eusebius gradually came to be received by the generations of theologians and politicians that followed. Eusebius's political theology became the mainstream political theory in what we now call Byzantium. At the core of this theory was the concept of symphony, an ostensibly harmonious relationship between church and state. This concept of symphony was millennialist and utopian. Although it presupposed that the Roman Empire embodied the kingdom of God as fully as possible, the reality was different. sometimes quite anti-utopian. Iconoclasm, a case to which I will come later, was such an anti-utopia. At the same time, it should be said that even if imperfect, symphony did provide a certain extent of peace and harmony to many phases of the relationship between the Church and state in Byzantium. Of course, even those periods can hardly be acknowledged as anything close to the kingdom of God on earth. The first major and sobering crisis in the relations between the Christian Church and the Roman state happened during their honeymoon. It is sometimes called Arianism, quite misleadingly. It would better be called a controversy about oneness and plurality in God, with the Council of Nicaea in 325 as its milestone. During this crisis, the Roman state suddenly faced not one, but several partners in the place that was supposed to be occupied by the Church. On the one hand, there were supporters of the Alexandrian presbyter Arius, including influential Eastern hierarchs such as Eusebius of Nicomedia and Eusebius of Caesarea. On the other hand, there were no less influential hierarchs led by two popes, one of Alexandria, Athanasius, and another of Rome, Julius. The state, which initially helped the Church to condemn the teaching of Arius at the Council of Nicaea, soon changed its mind and favored those whom the Council had condemned or marginalized. After that, for most of the 4th century, most Roman emperors supported the cause of those who doubted or rejected Nicaea. Eric Peterson ingeniously realized that the reasons why the state supported the monarchical theology articulated by Arius and his confederates were not only theological, but also political. This theology promoted the personal monarchy of the Father and the hierarchical structure of the Trinity. Both ideas could easily be referred to the absolute power of Christian monarchs. But the idea of the equality of the Father and the Son, which the Nicene Creed promoted, was hardly compatible with the model of monarchy and hierarchy-based power in the utopian kingdom of God, which had allegedly been incarnated in the Christianized Roman Empire. At the same time, the monarchical/hierarchical model of the Trinity perfectly suited the political model designed by Eusebius. The same Eusebius, by the way, supported monarchy and hierarchy of God in God. During the 4th century, when Trinitarian monarchism/hierarchism dominated the Roman Empire and its church, Christian emperors managed to consolidate political power in their own hands to a greater extent than did even their pagan predecessors on the throne. Paradoxically, the Christian Roman Empire, which was expected to become less autocratic as a result of the Christian message of humility and service, in reality demonstrated the opposite results. Trinitarian monarchism/hierarchism, I believe, was among the main contributors to its transformation towards autocracy. For quite a long time, Trinitarian hierarchism was the major supplier of legitimacy for the imperial court. At some point, however, it started to lose its flavor. This happened when convincing theological arguments against the monarchical and hierarchical model of the Trinity were elaborated upon, especially by the Cappadocians. As a result of this theological development, the monarchical/hierarchical model turned from legitimizing to delegitimizing and was eventually abandoned. Cappadocian theology, however, could not substitute the monarchical/hierarchical Trinity as the source of legitimacy for the Christian emperors. A new source of political legitimacy was found in its stead, where no one expected to find it, in Neoplatonism. The original attitude of Neoplatonism towards politics was mostly neutral or negative. It has been characterized as upholding Plato without politics. Despite its apolitical or even anti-political standpoint, Neoplatonism, in its Christianized version, came heavily to be employed as a new supplier of political legitimacy for the court, to the extent that it turned into a durable framework for most later versions of Christian political theology. It began again with Eusebius. In his Preparatio Evangelica, he supported the idea of a Christian polity, which was not dissimilar from the utopian Platonopolis, designed 2 decades earlier by the Neoplatonic Porphyry. Unlike the Neoplatonic utopian polis, which was never built, Eusebius envisaged the entire empire turning into a Christian Platonopolis. To some extent, this vision was realized. Ancient Neoplatonism provided a clearer and more convincing link between God and the political ruler than even Carl Schmitt could imagine in the 1920s. Schmitt's link was an iconoclastic and transcendental analogy, while for the Christian political theologians trained in Neoplatonism, the divine and political spheres had a more intrinsic relationship of image and participation. Christian emperors were proclaimed the images of the one God. On the one hand, they seemed like a significant downgrade in comparison with the pagan emperors who had been venerated as deities, gods themselves. On the other hand, a pagan emperor was a deity among many other gods, while the Christian emperor was the only image of the only God. Although his authority was supposed to be reduced in Christianity, in effect, it only increased. Another Neoplatonic idea of participation established a more intimate connection between one God and the ruler than in Schmitt's analogy. The analogy presupposes a transcendence of the divine power over any political power, while participation makes the divine power immanent in politics. Neoplatonism supplied Christianity with an even more politically charged concept, that of hierarchy. The Neoplatonic universe, in both its upper and lower chambers, was structured strictly hierarchically. Deities were sorted out in it according to their ranks in specially designed places, henats. The lower hierarchical structures mirrored the upper structures. Hierarchy for the Neoplatonists became a superstructure that engulfed any other structure and being. So it became for the Christian theologians, one of them who hid under the pseudonym of Dionysius Areopagite, also structured the Christian heavens and ecclesia hierarchically. He only substituted pagan deities with angels and linked ecclesiastical hierarchies with the divine ones. Pseudo-Dionysius was probably one of the most apolitical theologians in Christianity. Yet, unwillingly, he became one of the greatest, if not the greatest, Christian political theologian, whose thought has influenced Christian political philosophy immensely. His concept of hierarchy even now continues to be dominant in both ecclesial and political structures. It reached its heyday in the Middle Ages, when political, social, and ecclesial structures became rigidly hierarchical. This hierarchy was interpreted in ontological categories. They came to be recognized as having been established by jus divinum, the divine right. In the context of medieval political theology, let us return to interwar Germany and focus on the medievalist Ernst Kantorowicz. He can be listed together with Schmitt and Peterson as a scholar who managed to decipher classical theology and to extract from it some fascinating political theories. Kantorowicz was similar to Schmitt and Peterson in many regards. He wrote in the same period and in the same place, interwar Germany. All three scholars had similar conservative political preferences. Kantorowicz was a German nationalist who won an Iron Cross at Verdun, dreamed of destroying France, and participated in the anti-Polish riots in his native Poznan. When Nazis came to power, Kantorowicz expressed sympathy with some of their issues, with some of their causes. Norman Cantor even believes that, I quote him, except for the misfortune of being a Jew, Kantorowicz was the ideal Nazi scholar and intellectual, end of quote. Indeed, Kantorowicz was a Jew and did not want to deny his blood, I quote him. Eventually, despite his unrepented German nationalism and concurrence with many Nazi ideas, he had to leave his country and emigrated to the United States. There, he published his masterpiece, The King's Two Bodies. It became an instant classic. Although it was published as early as 1957, Princeton University Press keeps reprinting it to this day. Kantorowicz did with the Middle Ages what Peterson did with late antiquity. He discovered a technology of extracting political ideas from theological formulas. In other words, both scholars discovered political theologies which were expressed in theological terms and contributed to the legitimacy of political rulers. Both realized that at the core of those political theologies there was a Christology. For Peterson, the Arian, as it were, we said it's not a very helpful term, but still we use it. So the Arian standpoint that the Son is inferior to the Father implied a model for the absolutist monarchy of the Christian Roman emperors. Kantorowicz dealt with the dynasties that pretended to be successors to the Roman emperors. He argued that their legitimacy rested on their Christological constructs developed by their contemporary court theologians. Kantorowicz chose to analyze a collection of texts composed around AD 1100 by an unknown Norman theologian who developed argumentation in favor of the exclusive prerogatives of Christian kings during the investiture controversy. The Norman Anonymous, so he has become known in the scholarship, argued that the royal office reflects the power of God. Potestas enim regis potestas Dei est. A king, as an individual person and the holder of the office, is similar to Christ in both his humanity and divinity. This was a bolder comparison than the Byzantine political theologians would permit themselves, with all their love to their rulers. The Byzantine political theologians had developed highly sophisticated and dizzyingly nuanced theories about the imperial authority and its relationship to the divine. Gilbert d'Argon published an encyclopedic study on this matter. If we compare the theological hermeneutics of the Byzantine and Norman kingships, we will see how big a theological and cultural gap there was between them. The latter seems to be a vulgar copy of the former. Even Kantorowicz, who was not a theologian and did not know the nuances of the high Byzantine Christology, recognized that the theology of Norman Anonymous was deficient, with, I quote him, an historian and adoptionist flavor, end of quote. The Christology that the medieval Norman theologian promoted was rather poor. In particular, it was articulated in a language with theological vulgarisms, such as persona mixta, mixed person, or even forbidden words such as gemina, twinned persons. This language was applied to the medieval kings as reflecting two natures of Christ. The word mixture, syncrasis, was taken with a big grain of suspicion in Eastern Christology, especially after it became a keyword in the monophysite Christology of Eutyches. As for the word twinned, it was unheard of and indeed unthinkable in the Eastern Christological discourses. The idea of mixed or twinned person was not even Nestorian, as Kantorovich suggested, because Nestorianism affirmed a single person, persona or prosopon, in Christ. The Christology of the Norman Anonymous went further than Nestorianism would have gone, in dividing the persona of the king. Paradoxically, this political Christology appears to be quite Eutychian, which is the opposite to Nestorianism. The Byzantine monastic Eutyches taught that the humanity of Christ changed and appropriated many natural properties of divinity. This teaching is usually called monophysitism and should be differentiated from the Miaphysite or Miaphysite teaching of Dioscorus of Alexandria and Severus of Antioch. Although they also claimed that Christ had one nature, in their interpretation, Christ's humanity remained unchangeable and consubstantial with our humanity. Eutychianism insinuated an ontological alienation of Christ's humanity. The ontological status of his humanity became significantly higher than the ontological status of humankind. The anonymous Norman author, in a similar manner, implied that the king's power is not functional but ontological. It has its own substance. The royal power was ontologized even more in the political theology of the Tudors in England, as Ernst Kantorovich demonstrated in the same book, The King's Two Bodies. The title of this seminal study highlights its main idea, that kings were believed to have two bodies, physical and corporate. The former, the physical, was mortal, while the latter, the corporate, never died. All subjects of the English crown were included in it. As a Tudor lawyer explained, I quote him, "The king has two capacities, for he has two bodies, the one whereof is a body natural, consisting of natural members, as every other man has, and in this he is subject to passions and death as other men are. The other is a body politic," this is the language of the 16th century, "and the members thereof are his subjects, and he and his subjects together compose their corporation," end of quote. The name of the justice who made this statement is Justice Southcote. And he made this statement in the case of William versus Berkeley. The ontologization of power, either in the form of the twinned person of the king or his corporate body, was an extreme form of political theology. Indeed, I believe it was a heretical political theology. Once one starts making political power a thing and not a function, it opens doors to dictatorships, wars, and other abuses. Byzantium, a prototype for many patterns of Western political theologies, which usually were copied with inaccuracies and without preserving subtlety, did not go as far as that. True, there were other, more sophisticated and less heretical forms of ontologization of power in the Christian East. One of them was already mentioned, and it is the concept of hierarchy. However, in the hierarchical structures, the power of its holder is defined not by the holder's ontological status, but by his or her place in the hierarchy. In other words, not the king per se, but his place had ontological gravity. That is why the dethronement of the Byzantine Vasilevses was a rather well-known routine and not an existential tragedy, which was so well described by Shakespeare in his Richard II. Ernst Kantorovich described Christological ideas which underpinned the patterns of political power during the Middle Ages and early modernity. The Christian East turn the page. The Christian East applied Christological models to its political patterns much earlier in Christian antiquity. While the West focused more on the personal power of kings, the East applied Christology to the entire complex of church-state relations. I would identify three such Christological models which had political underpinnings: Chalcedonian or Diophysite, Miaphysite, Monothelite, and finally Nestorian. Let me give a brief characterization of each of these Christologies. Both Diophysite and Miaphysite Christologies believe that humanity and divinity in Christ do not constitute distinct subjects, but have been united intrinsically into one being. On the one hand, humanity and divinity are whole, and were never alienated from what they originally had been. On the other hand, they remain distinct from one another and have never been separated. The difference between the two approaches is that the Diophysite Christology calls humanity and divinity natures, physis, and therefore speaks of two natures in Christ, while the Miaphysite Christology speaks of one nature in Christ, miaphysis, hence is the word Miaphysite Christology, in order to stress the unity of Christ even more than the Diophysite Christology does. The Monothelite Christology tried to reconcile the two above-mentioned Christologies by combining the theological language of two natures with the idea of single activity and will in Christ. Finally, the Nestorian Christology envisaged a significantly wider gap between humanity and divinity, to the extent of admitting two subjects in Christ, God and man. Rather, a man, a particular human being. As mentioned earlier, the Byzantine ideal of church-state relations was symphonic. The classical definition of this ideal can be found in the preamble to the sixth novella promulgated by the Emperor Justinian in the beginning of the 6th century. I quote this novella, it's a classical text. The greatest gifts that God in his celestial benevolence has bestowed on mankind are priesthood and sovereignty, the one serving on matters divine and the other ruling over human affairs and caring for them. Each proceeds from one and the same authority and regulates human life. Thus, nothing could have as great a claim on the attention of sovereigns as the honor of priests, seeing that they are the very ones who constantly offer prayer to God on the sovereign's behalf. Hence, should the one be above a reproach in every respect and enjoy access to God, while the other keeps in correct and proper order the realm that has been entrusted to it, there will be a satisfactory harmony conferring upon every conceivable benefit on the human race. End of quote. Harmony here translates the Greek symphonia or Latin consonantia. In this model, priesthood and sovereignty are presented as two distinct political entities, which nevertheless come from the same source. It's a reference to the line from the novella, each proceeds from one and the same authority. This is the reference to the single source. And focus on the same subject, human life. This is the wording from the novella. In other words, the structure of the formula of symphony is the following: unity to duality, then back to unity. Exactly the same is the structure of the Christological formula as adopted by the Council of Chalcedon in 451. Unity of Christ, duality of his natures, and then again the statement about the unity of Christ. In other words, there is an apparent coherence between how the Byzantines saw the relationship between the two natures of Christ and how they saw relations between their church and state. Justinian's symphony can hence be characterized as Chalcedonian, which is not a surprise given the support that Justinian extended to the Chalcedonian faction of the Byzantine Church. Justinian's ideal of symphony remained an ideal. In practice, the Miaphysite formula of power was implemented. In this formula, the church and state could hardly distinguish their respective spheres of existence. Even their perceptions of themselves conflated into a single theopolitical self-awareness. This can be observed, for example, in the fact that during the Byzantine period, theologians virtually never reflected on the church as an entity different from the state. Those who did reflect on it, such as John Chrysostom, usually had a non-conformist tilt in their views on church-state relations. Thus, the Byzantine church and state effectively conflated into a single theopolitical nature, as it were. In this nature, they could be distinguished only theoretically, and here I use the wording of Cyril of Alexandria, ti theoria moni, what he applied to the natures of Christ, humanity and divinity in Christ, that they are distinguished only theoretically, can be applied to this model of symphony when the church and the state could be distinguished only theoretically. Paradoxically, the imperial ideologists who were most Diophysites preferred the Miaphysite modality of the church-state relations. There was a period in Byzantine history during the 7th century when Christological theory and political practices converged. The emperor of the time, Heraclius, who reigned from 610 through 641, and who was a gifted politician with an ambition of becoming a second Justinian, embarked on a project of reconciliation between the pro- and anti-Chalcedonian churches. With the assistance of his court theologians, he designed a theological formula that he believed would satisfy both quarreling sides. On the one hand, this formula stated that Christ had one hypostasis and two natures, and this was to please the Chalcedonian side. On the other hand, the single Christ had one activity, energia, and this was to accommodate the anti-Chalcedonians. Later on, the single activity, energia, in this formula was replaced by single will, thelema or thelesis. The formula was called monoenergist and or monothelite. This eclectic Christological formula was designed to bridge the theological and political gap between two large groups, those who supported and those who opposed the Council of Chalcedon. It can also be interpreted as having the following political implications. On the one hand, it respected the distinctiveness of the church vis-à-vis the state. On the other hand, their unity, according to this formula, had the same source of activity and one will, and that was the emperor. The monothelite formula, which was adopted mostly for political reasons, perfectly described the church-state relations in the Eastern Roman Empire in the period when it was passing from antiquity to the Middle Ages. It is true that monoenergism and monothelitism were condemned at the Ecumenical Council in Constantinople in the years 680-681. Nevertheless, as a political formula, monothelitism continued to define church-state relations in Byzantium until its demise. The monothelite political model culminated during iconoclasm. Scholars still argue about both the theological and political causes that triggered the controversy about sacred images. They agree, however, that its single promoter was the state, which forced the church to comply with its policies regarding icons. One of the main reasons that might have motivated the imperial authority was to enhance the legitimacy of its authority. Iconoclasm was an ideal case of the monothelite symphony, as it were, when the emperor unilaterally imposed his will upon both the state and the church. It was also a case of political theology in the Schmittian sense, when theology smoothly translates into politics. While in the Eastern Roman Empire, also known as Byzantium, there was no separation between the church and state whatsoever, with a degree of distinction between them varying from insignificant to zero. Outside this empire, in the majority of cases, the church was forced into separation from the state. This produced a new model of church-state relations, which can be called Nestorian. Nestorianism, as mentioned earlier, presupposed a significant distance between divinity and humanity in Christ. This distance was caused by the interpretation of divinity and humanity as self-standing subjects, God and a man. This interpretation was promoted by the Archbishop of Constantinople, Nestorius, for which reason this Christological doctrine received his name. It was condemned at the Ecumenical Council in Ephesus in 431. In a way similar to how the Nestorians perceived the gap between divinity and humanity in Christ, the churches outside the Roman Empire were forced to keep distance from the state. The states that enforced such distance were not Christian. One of the earliest examples of this, after Constantine, occurred in the Persian Empire, the eternal rival of the Greco-Roman world. The Persians, with several exceptions, tolerated Christianity, but did not offer Christian bishops any symphonic favor, even though the latter tried hard to attain it. The Christian community in Persia had to live in quite a pluralistic society with no preferences from the state. Occasionally, it was persecuted. The majority of this minority consisted of the Nestorians, mostly Christians from eastern Syria, who refused to comply with the Council of Ephesus and thus were expelled from Roman soil. This experience of living in a pluralistic society with no benefits from the state was first painful for the Church, but soon proved to be to its advantage. The Nestorian Christians, also known as Assyrians, made good use of their experiences of survival in the Persian environment, namely in their mission to Asia, mostly to Southeast Asia. These experiences allowed them successfully to establish themselves in the countries and societies as impenetrable to foreign influence as that of the Chinese. I believe the success of this mission has to do with the Nestorian model of relationship with the states, where the Church sent its missionaries. At the time when the Chalcedonian churches in Byzantium lived through Miaphysite sorts of symphony, the Miaphysite churches, which after the Arab conquest of Syria and Egypt found themselves under the control of the Caliphate, had to embark on the Nestorian model of relations with the Muslim state, even though they despised everything Nestorian. In effect, most of those churches, which we know as Oriental, continue to live according to the same Nestorian pattern. Most Byzantine churches had to adopt the same pattern when the Ottomans established their own state on the ruins of Byzantium. The Nestorian model of church-state relations, which the Eastern churches have experienced since at least the 5th century, was not dissimilar to the Jeffersonian wall and other modern models of separation between the church and state. Thus, the Eastern churches pioneered the models of both unity and separation from the state, and the Western churches followed them. I mentioned earlier that the churches in the East were forced into the Nestorian model of relations with the state. This model was never their choice. They always preferred the one nature model whenever it was possible, or even when it was impossible. Modernity, with its disestablishmentness, I like the word, caused a lot of pain to both Western and Eastern churches, probably more than with its secularization and modernism. The Catholic Church suffered phantom pains, as it were, after being stripped of much of its own political power, while the phantom pains for many Eastern churches came from losing privileged relationships with the state. Following their symphonic instinct and suffering from the deprivation of political influence, the churches usually did not miss the slightest opportunity to collaborate with political regimes, even when these regimes were hostile or even murderous. Perhaps the most bizarre kind of symphony that ever occurred in the history of Christianity was the one with the regime whose established religion was militant atheism. I would characterize the modus vivendi of the Russian Orthodox Church in the Soviet Union as symphonic. The formula of this symphony was articulated by Metropolitan Sergei Stragorodsky, later the Patriarch of Moscow, and published by the Central Communist newspaper Izvestia in 1927. I quote from this publication. These are the words of Sergei. We want to be Orthodox and at the same time to recognize the Soviet Union as our civic homeland, the joys and successes of which are our joys and successes, and whose failures are our failures." End of quote. Needless to say that among the greatest joys of the Soviet homeland, as it were, would be to get rid of any religion altogether. Many historians argue, and this is also an official line of the Moscow Patriarchate, that the Church had two bad choices: to be exterminated or to collaborate with the regime with the hope of survival. Therefore, the best option that the Church had, even though it was not a good option, was to collaborate with the communist regime. Others counter-argue that the Church by all means had to avoid collaboration with the atheistic regime. As an alternative, the Christians could go to the underground and, if needed, had to die as martyrs. In effect, many underground groups, all of them with dubious canonical status, mushroomed during the waves of the Soviet persecutions. Collaboration with the state at any price did not save the official Church from persecutions. Most of its bishops, priests, and monastics were killed or exiled to the gulags, and most churches were shut down or destroyed. Those Russian hierarchs who survived Stalin's purges in the 1930s after World War II were recruited by the Soviet government to propagate in the world the advantages of the communist ideology. A new sort of symphony was established. Its scope, however, was very narrow. This symphony served only the purposes of Soviet propaganda abroad, and it benefited only a minuscule group of hierarchs. The majority of ordinary faithful continued to suffer and were restricted in their basic rights. Again, some people would argue that the Church did not have other choices but to cooperate with the state. But I believe there was something more to this cooperation than simply choosing between two bad options. It was a desperate and sometimes subconscious need to have a political partner, even if this partner wanted to kill you. Some would call it Stockholm Syndrome. I would call it symphonic syndrome. The same symphonic syndrome moved the Orthodox Churches to support radical nationalist regimes and ideologies which mushroomed in the traditionally Orthodox countries in the interwar period. In addition to the custom of treating any political regime as a partner, the churches were motivated by what we now call traditional values, which were usually promoted by fascist and nationalist regimes and ideologies. Most Orthodox countries in different periods of the 20th century lived through conservative dictatorships or ideologies close to fascism. They were in most cases modeled on Italian fascism and sometimes came close to Nazism. The Italian word il clerico fascista, coined by Father Luigi Sturzo in the 1920s, is also applicable to many clergy, hierarchs, primates, and even saints in the Orthodox churches during the last century. One of the most obvious examples is the Romanian National Legionary State, which existed in 1940 and 1941. It featured a new one-party regime with a strong agenda of Orthodox conservatism. This state was controlled by the right-wing nationalist Legion of Archangel Michael. This was a clerical movement and then a party with around 30% of its members in the parliament after the elections in 1937 being priests. A priest from this movement wrote in its heyday, I quote him, "A true priest will therefore be a legionnaire," that is the member of the Legion of Archangel Michael, "by the nature of things, just as a legionnaire will be in his turn, and again by the nature of things, a legionnaire, the best son of the church." End of quote. Most scholars agree that the Legion was a movement with a strong fascist tilt. There were less numerous movements in the Orthodox countries which had a similar tilt. One of them, Assembly or Zbor in Serbian, was organized in Serbia by Dimitrije Ljotić. Although not as popular as the Romanian Legion, the Serbian Zbor had many similarities with the former. Both combined a conservative and nationalistic political agenda with a strong religious motivation. Zbor was also supported by influential hierarchs, one of them being Bishop Nikolai Velimirovich. Scholars still argue what kind of fascism Ljotić's ideology was close to. One can easily recognize in it some classical fascist features, such as the idea of a corporatist state similar to Mussolini's Lo Stato Corporativo. Unlike Mussolini, however, Ljotić regarded religion the core of national identity. Most Orthodox thinkers and hierarchs outspoken in promoting ultra-conservative and ultra-nationalist agendas in the interwar period felt closer to Italian fascism than to German Nazism. Nevertheless, from time to time, they uttered some nice words about Hitler as well. The above-mentioned Nikolai Velimirovich, for instance, in his article The Nationalism of St. Sava, published in 1935, urged his readers to, I quote him, render homage to the present German leader who realized that nationalism without religion is an anomaly, a cold and insecure mechanism, end of quote. Another prominent conservative hierarch of the time, the primate of the Russian Orthodox Church outside Russia, Metropolitan Anastasy Gribanovsky, praised Hitler in 1938 with the following words, I quote him, "Not only the German nation commemorates you with fervent love and devotion to the throne of the highest. The best people of all nations who wish you peace and justice see you as a leader in the world struggle for peace and truth. Your feat for the German people and the greatness of the German Empire made you an exemplary model worthy of imitation, and a model of how one should love one's people and one's country, how one should stand for national treasures and eternal values. May God strengthen you and the German people in the fight against hostile forces who wish death of our people. May He give you, your country, your government, and the army good health, prosperity, and all the good haste for many years." End of quote. Both fascism and Nazism were quite popular in the conservative circles of the Russian-wide immigration in the West. Some immigrants collaborated with these regimes, and some even provided inspiration for them. This inspiration came from a particular direction of what we can call Russian political theology, as it developed in the beginning of the 20th century. Political theology was not a part of the official theological curriculum in the Romanovs' Russia. It emerged outside this curriculum and immediately took two opposite directions. One direction was liberal and accommodating for the developments in the progressive part of Russian society. That part wanted emancipation from monarchy, constitution, equal rights for all strata of society, etc. A political theology that reflected these desiderata was articulated by such prominent figures in Russian religious philosophy as Vladimir Solovyov, Отец Sergei Bulgakov, Nikolai Berdyaev. It influenced the program of aggiornamento adopted by the Council of the Russian Church in 1917-1918. I believe this council was a forerunner of Vatican II. The other direction of the Russian political theology at the time was reactionary and populist. It tried theologically to substantiate monarchy, was anti-modernist and anti-democratic. Among the protagonists in this direction of political theology were some prominent hierarchs, including Metropolitan Antony Khrapovitsky, who later founded the conservative Russian Orthodox Church outside Russia, mentioned earlier in connection with greetings to Hitler, the Archbishop Serafim Sobolev. The latter, for instance, believed that democracy is a diabolic political system. He wrote a book titled Russian Ideology, Ruskaya Ideologia, which can be regarded a manifesto of Russian conservative political theology. Recently, the Moscow Patriarchate proclaimed him as saint. Now I'd like to focus my microscope on a figure who contributed to this same conservative political theology in a special way. His name is Sergei Nilus, and he composed pietistic pamphlets and books for the people, as it were, for simple people. His approach to political theology was völkisch. He picked up stories and prophecies from the past and extracted from them lessons about the divine character of monarchy and how gravely sin those who challenged this institution. He became famous for popularizing the figure of Seraphim Sarovsky, a Russian monk who flourished in the first 3 decades of the 19th century. Nilus published spiritual conversations of this monk with one Nikolai Motovilov, and concluded from these conversations how important it is for his contemporaries wholeheartedly to support the Romanovs' dynasty. Recent studies have established that those conversations were to a great extent fictional. Even more fictional was an appendix attached to their publication. This appendix is known as the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, and they were published for the first time by Nilus. Scholars still argue by whom and where this forgery was produced. Most likely, the Imperial Russian intelligence agencies were behind the protocols. The purpose of this appendix was to compromise the Jewish participants in the anti-Tsarist movement, and this purpose cohered with the general goal of the book, to bring convincing arguments in favor of monarchy and to defy its enemies. The protocols became widely popular reading in the pre-revolutionary Russia. Even Tsar Nicholas Romanov read them with a pencil in his hand. After the Bolshevik Revolution, they were transmitted to the West. It is believed that the person who brought the protocols to Germany was Piotr Szabelski-Borg, a devoted royalist and participant in the anti-Bolshevik military campaign. After this campaign failed, he was rescued by the Germans during the winter of 1918-1919. When in Berlin, Szabelski-Borg met a German nationalist, Ludwig Müller von Hausen. Von Hausen helped publish the first German translation of the protocols in 1920 in the Völkischer Beobachter. The protocols became a bestseller in Germany and no doubt contributed to the rapid spread of Nazi anti-Semitic propaganda. The protocols also inspired many Orthodox in other countries. For instance, in 1926, a Serbian devotional group, God Admirers, Bohomolci, led by the above-mentioned Bishop Nikolai Velimirovich, disseminated the protocols in Serbia. Anti-Semitism, inspired by the protocols, continued to be a part of the modern Schmittian versions of Orthodox political theology even now. Soon after liberation from Soviet atheism, the largest Russian monastery, the Lavra of St. Sergei, Troitsa Sergieva Lavra, along with urgently needed spiritual literature, published a collection, Russia Before the Second Coming, Россия перед вторым пришествием. It was a compilation of quotes and prophecies, as it were, often falsified, about the powers of evil working against Russia. The West and Jews were named among those powers, and the protocols of the Elders of Zion were included in the edition. Bishop Nikolai Velimirovich, by the way, the saint proclaimed by the Serbian Church, and with him many other conservative Orthodox political theologians, counterposed Orthodox nationalism to the secular West. He accused the West of anthropocentrism, which has substituted God with man. The irony, however, is that nationalism is a Western secular construct. In the capacity of an ideology, it emerged as an organic part of the Enlightenment project. Adamantios Korais, who was among the main proponents of nationalism on Orthodox soil, discussed it first in the Parisian Société des Observateurs de l'Homme, a quintessentially anthropocentric society. After having been imported to the Orthodox countries, nationalism combined with the religious identity of the peoples there. Its secularist pedigree was thoroughly camouflaged. An ancient and specifically Eastern structure of the Orthodox Church, autocephaly, facilitated the appropriation of nationalist ideologies in the Orthodox world. In the West, nationalism clashed with the universalist structure of the Catholic Church. which responded by condemning it in the forms of Gallicanism or Febronianism. In the East, nationalism cohered with the autocephalous, meaning self-headed, independent structure of the local Orthodox churches. Because of the compatibility between the autocephalous structure of Orthodoxy and ethnic states, nationalism, originally a secular ideology, was readily adopted in the Orthodox Church. It became a quasi-religious phenomenon without much clashing with religion proper, and sometimes even substituting the latter. As a result, there are more people who identify themselves as Orthodox than those who, for instance, believe in God. Raymond Aron's term religion séculière describes Orthodox nationalism best. A particular instance of this religion séculière is an ideologem that emerged recently, that of the Russian world, Ruski Mir. It is not exactly the same as the nationalistic ideologies in most Southern or Eastern European countries, which are usually identified with one nation. The nationalism of the Russian world is supra-ethnic and indeed neo-imperial. It exploits culture, language, and faith to rebuild the Russian world within the framework of the Romanovs' Russia and, if possible, even Stalin's Soviet Union. This ideology has inspired the only two wars that were waged on the European continent during the 21st century, the one on the territory of Georgia in 2008 and the other on the territory of Ukraine. The latter one continues even now, and we are in its sixth year. The ideology of the Russian world sometimes presents itself as political orthodoxy. In effect, both are similar to the particular case of political theology, which was promoted by Carl Schmitt and opposed by Eric Patterson. Politicized religion, in conclusion, is still very much active in our days and causes a lot of evil. However, it is probably as ancient as religion itself. In the period of antiquity, politicized religion was a norm, the only form of religion that people publicly practiced. Christ brought a change when he said, disappointingly for many of his followers, "My kingdom is not of this world." Early Christianity followed this non-conformist principle, which was quite a departure from the common practices of antiquity. The hostility of the Roman Empire to the Christian communities corroborated the Christian non-conformist attitude. When the hostile tide started changing to a more favorable one, Christianity faced the challenge of getting back on the track of the old Greco-Roman religions, to become public, serve salus populi Romani, provide legitimacy for the political authorities, etc. A significant part of the church followed that track, but not all of it. A number of non-conformist movements emerged that tried to preserve the early Christian ethos. The most significant among them became known as monasticism. The Christian East has authored most models of politicized religion. The West often followed the East, with a little original input. The Western copies of politicized religion usually were not as refined as the Eastern originals. These original models were embodied in the Eastern Roman Empire, known to us now as Byzantium, in late antiquity, and in the Western Christendom of the Middle Ages. Modernity, with its Hobbesian and Jeffersonian separation between church and state, challenged the old symphony-based models of politicized religion. This religion, nevertheless, has survived even the unfavorable conditions of modernity. It was reinvented and recast in many new forms. This time, the West led, and the East followed. They often took their inspiration from the romanticized Middle Ages and romanticized Byzantium. Some countries in the West, and later in the East, being tired of modernization of their societies, tried to resurrect the glories of Germania or of to Byzantium. Some even now try to recreate the romanticized and ideal versions of the medieval Svetaya Rus. The results are always the same. On the basis of romantic blueprints, they usually end up with totalitarian regimes. These regimes utilize what Erik Peterson criticized as political theology. We should probably not follow Peterson in condemning political theology in wholesale. After all, this term was rehabilitated after World War II in the framework of the so-called theology after Auschwitz. Its founding father, Jürgen Moltmann, was, by the way, influenced by Erik Peterson. Since then, it has become one of the most studied theological disciplines in the world. Modern political theology studies all forms of interaction between the church and public square, a very respectable and legitimate field. What Peterson criticized could be called not political theology, but by more appropriate names, secular or political religion. It can also be called, and sometimes it calls itself, political orthodoxy, political Catholicism, political Protestantism, etc. This phenomenon may have many names, but its quintessence is the same. It was articulated by Hannah Arendt, a secular Jewish philosopher who understood some things about Christianity better than many Christian theologians did in her time. Now I quote Hannah Arendt. If we try to inspire public political life once more with religious passion, or to use religion as a means of political distinctions, the result may very well be the transformation and perversion of religion into an ideology. End of quote. She apparently meant the totalitarian ideologies of communism, fascism, and Nazism. This list, however, can be expanded and should include the ideologies that seem to have been appropriated by Christianity to the point of merging the latter with the former, such as, for instance, nationalism, which is particularly strong in the world of Eastern Christianity. The most recent ideology of the Russian world can be put on the list as well. These ideologies demonstrate that politicized religion leads to substituting theology with ideology as its simulacrum, the transcendent beyond with the visible here, religion with politics. It causes the alienation of religion as such and opens doors for conflicts, tragedies, and even wars. Thank you for your attention.